that, we have Tooba, who is founder of Amoeba AI, and she's doing something very different, very new. It's AI++. So please give her a big hand, and we'll see she has some interesting things to talk about today.
So the name of the conversation today is essentially waking up naked in the age of AI, why we have all essentially lost our minds and how to get them back. Don't worry, there's no pornography in the slideshow. I promise, Arjun, this is not a controversial conversation, but it is an interesting topic to talk through. But before I dive into this, a little bit of background about me. As Arjun mentioned, my name is Tooba. I'm the founder and CEO of Amoeba AI. I'm actually not a marketer. I am a friend of a marketer. My background is entirely in data science. My PhD is from MIT, looking at neurosymbolic AI systems. So as Arjun said, we're exploring the space of data and data interaction in a slightly different way than you would see with other folks, but happy to talk through that. And then prior to starting Amoeba, I was the VP of Qualified after most of the AI product suite. So if you see those Piper billboards everywhere, that was like my last PSC before I left there. So this is one question I want to start everyone with, which is, it's controversial as a question, which is, have you ever woken up thinking where you are and why you're naked? But that's essentially what marketing feels like in 2025. I use the term, quote unquote, naked and afraid. And for those who've watched that show, you understand what it means, where you're in the wilderness, there's a lot going on. Essentially, you have to somehow find a way to survive. And that's the landscape the marketers are in right now. We've essentially have a ton of things at our disposal, so we've automated ourselves into an existential crisis. And I like to say all the time, our dashboards are fully dressed, and sometimes dressed in designer wear, because they all look gorgeous. Our slides look really pretty. Our spreadsheets look perfect. But if you think about if all of those pieces were working, why at the end of the day would our strategy fail, which is why I feel our strategy is totally naked. So I talk about this overwhelm. The slide, the image itself gives me anxiety to look at because it's like eternal chaos, essentially. But we're drowning in all sorts of data and tools. So what I mean by all sorts of data, again, over here, I'm referring to any kind of data. So we started off with structured data, right? All of us were living in kind of our spreadsheets and Tableau, Power BI, all of that stuff. Then came all of our unstructured data, so talks like this, like anything you're saying to your customers, including your assets, including your videos. So what's happening is you're creating more and more data, so that's creating more and more overwhelm. Essentially, you have a ton of these things that are screaming for your attention. So you're looking at how did your last webinar perform, but simultaneously you're looking at, okay, my bottom of funnel leads are dropping, but simultaneously you're looking at, okay, my CEO said I need to start advertising on TikTok today, which is a completely new channel for me. And then amongst all of that, you still have to make sense of like, why is something happening, which is the most important question. And then that why, which is the most important piece, essentially gets lost in the equation when there's so much at your disposal. So I use this image as a forward-looking image in the sense that we were promised that all these tools and all these new technologies that are coming out were meant to make us smarter. Somehow they were meant to take away from the workload that we're facing right now. Now, Arjun spoke a little bit about composition of teams and how that composition of teams are changing. Essentially, like how are you going from a big team to a maybe more streamlined team, or if you have a big team, could you get X amount more business because your team is big? But essentially what you ended up with is a world where you're there with glorified calculators. What I mean by calculators is you have all these tools that are just telling you A plus B equals C. So they might as well be a calculator. Some of them do in a really fancy way. If you look at, I guess, ChatGPT as an example, when you say, like, why is something happening? Yes, it can pretend to tell you why something is happening, but its inception is in essentially A plus B equals C. And then on top of that, we were also told, okay, X amount of things are going to be replaced by AI. So whether it replaces our jobs, whether it replaces our job functions, essentially. So it's creating this form of panic. Now, if you feel like I'm over-indexing on psychology, there is a ton of psychology that goes behind the scenes of when new technology comes out and how that technology is adopted, and then what impact it has on your day-to-day life, and then in essence on your business. So we're right now in what I would call like the pit of the adoption cycle. So a frame I like to use here is instead of actually making our lives easier, what it ended up doing was exposing us. It didn't take our jobs because thankfully we have our jobs still. Knock on wood for that. It ended up just exposing how fragmented and how bad certain things were. So every potential opportunity that exists within your data is now highlighted even further. There are all these different channels you could optimize on, and then the job of a marketer becomes even harder because now you have to pick and choose your battles on where you can eventually have an impact. So you end up in a position like this. We have all these different tools that can track all your clicks, essentially. Everything that's happening, every attribution piece of software that exists out there can tell you, okay, XYZ happened before this deal converts, right? But you don't really know why that click happened, which is like the causal why. So what happens is you can't really repeat that in the future if the historical data was different from where the future was going. You're focused on movement. So we know something happened, so we need to do something against it. It's our instinct that if a car moves in front of us, our instinct is to, okay, like it's our turn to move as well. But you're not focusing on meaning. Very rarely do I sit in rooms where folks are looking at their data and say, I'm going to stop doing something, instead of saying, I'm going to now start to do X amount more because I see more in my data. And then last but not least, we're chasing these insights. So again, you're walking into your boardroom conversation, your C-suite conversation, and you're constantly getting asked the question, why is this happening? Or what happened to XYZ? But all you're doing is reactively chasing that. You end up with noise in essentially designer clothing. Feel free to make fun of my slides, by the way. I am not a marketer, like I said, so I try my best. But as you can see, there are alignment problems clearly on this slide as well. I like pointing it out because I think it's like part of, just my charm. It's like everything is not perfect. So the two things that I want to frame for you is data is not context, and correlation is not causation. And these are two foundational principles. Again, not just talking about Amoeba or neurosymbolic AI or transformers or all these technologies that exist, but then you sitting on a wealth of information and how you think about that, essentially. So what I mean by data is not context is I can look at everyone who's sitting in the front here, and then I can deduce by what they're wearing, okay, like you might have a preference for black, as an example. But that's not really causation, right? Essentially, just because you're wearing black today doesn't mean you might like black tomorrow. And that, more importantly, if I were to just pick up on that signal and I was to personalize the next time you walked into a store and say, hey, I heard you like black, and then you suddenly hate black, you immediately turned off. So I think it's important to understand that just because you see it a certain way doesn't mean that that's the ultimate truth around it. And again, just because something happened, you have to understand the causality of why it happened, not because two things happened together means that they're immediately linked together. So that's essentially the problem that we're solving at Amoeba. We have built a neurosymbolic AI platform, and let me break that down for you. So you see a lot of stuff on the slide here, which is like knowledge, information, brains, neurons. Essentially, neural nets, and transformers are also pinned by neural nets, look at how humans, how our brains process data, and essentially that's what they've tried to replicate. So the reason neurosymbolic AI systems are really interesting is because they use a combination of AI techniques. So it could use traditional machine learning, model ensembles. These could be things like your predictive models that have always existed. It uses a combination of neural nets. In our case, it's a liquid neural net, which is proprietary to us. But idea is you're using the best of everything that's available in AI and combining it in a way that you end up with a brain for your business. So you end up with a reasoning layer that could combine your liquid LNNs or liquid neural nets, that could combine your liquid neural nets that are learning in real time, but then you also end up with a symbolic layer. And symbolic in this case is deterministic. So what is your business? What are the rules of your business? What's happening in your business that's like particular to you, but without you having to dictate that. The analogy I like to use here is if you think about all of us are, just show of hands, everyone's using an LLM now, right? Essentially? Okay, great. So if you were to take an LLM and you were to customize it or make it your own, you can do it a bunch of different ways, but the most common way folks do that is by giving it a ton of instructions and saying, this is what I'm looking to get out of it. So your prompt plus your instructions makes it your custom GPT, as an example. So the thing that's different about neurosymbolic models or neurosymbolic systems is that those instructions are inferred into the system. So you don't essentially have to tell the system, this is what I'm looking to get out of it. So you end up in a place where the system is not biased by how you think about your business, but actually what sits within your data. Now, you can always impact the system. That's always going to be a thing. But you don't have to give the ultimate definition of a system. Okay, so the way I describe it is very simply, you're giving your data a prefrontal cortex. So prefrontal cortex is a part of your brain that develops that allows you to make great logical decisions. It happens a little bit earlier in women than it does in men. It's a joke that we like to use always, but the idea there is that your data is just some matter that's sitting there, but you want to give it the ability to be able to process in a way that's useful to you versus just having it sit there and you taking on the mental load of figuring out what it needs to process, how it needs to process it, what outputs you need to receive from it. So the paradigm doesn't change. At the end of the day, you still ingest the data. You can ask it questions or you can tell the system tell you what's happening. But then the little green arrow that you see in the middle is where the neurosymbolic system comes into play, which is our reasoning. And then everything, Arjun was mentioning this, nothing should stop directly at an insight. We're looking for systems that are fully governed, full running systems. So we want systems that can either give you recommendations or actions or take actions on your behalf. But a lot of the systems that exist today, as you can see, go data, question, action. So they miss the reasoning element, right? And what happens when you miss the reasoning element is you're not understanding why a certain action is being taken, and that action is probably being taken on behalf of what worked in the past, your historical data, or essentially on some basic mathematics. And the reason that doesn't work is, say you wake up tomorrow and the stock market crashes. Everything that you knew about your business suddenly goes away. None of your historical data is relevant anymore. Wouldn't you want a system that then understands that, and the actions that it's proposing you take are more inferred based on some synthetic data or some other data that's outside in the world, not just your data, to understand truly what are the things that you would need to do to keep your business on track. Now, what does that mean in your day-to-day? It's basic questions like, why did pipeline drop last week? You can ask this question of a transformer, you can ask this question in a Tableau, you can ask this question in a bunch of existing tools, but again, those tools are doing data, question, action, missing the reasoning layer. Which campaign actually drives qualified leads? Now, a neurosymbolic system is not just looking at, hey, this is the best campaign that's driving a qualified lead. It's looking at, this is the best campaign that's driving a qualified lead for you. So it's not really relying on just the metric of there's a delta where your qualified leads went up, but also these are the right kind of qualified leads in order for you to be able to close your business. And then simulations like, what happens if I move 10% of my budget from Meta to LinkedIn? Does everything fall apart? What can I do? But allowing you a good sandbox where you can test that without actually taking your dollars out of Meta into LinkedIn in real life. And that thought is really scary because once the money is spent, it's gone, right, at the end of the day. So you want systems where you're able to pull from the system what are the possible scenarios, outcomes that could exist if I were to do X, Y, Z. Think about it in terms of a flight simulator, right? You're not going to take these risks when a flight is in motion, but in a flight simulator, you'll say, okay, what if I put the nose of the plane up a little bit to see what might happen in these conditions? Next time you're flying that plane, you're going to be better prepared in order to see. By the way, I'm not advocating that you fly a plane after you use a flight simulator. It's not advised. Generally, you should have enough flying hours, but once you're able to simulate in a way that you can build trust in that, it's a really easy thing to then take that because you're supported by data in the background. So what does Amoeba do differently? Amoeba does not hallucinate. It's not a transformer-based system. It's a neurosymbolic system. So it's obviously grounded in evidence packs. Amoeba does not need a Sherpa, meaning you constantly don't need to be thinking about, okay, what else changed in my business that I need to redefine to my transformers? Or did I remember to tell it that 2 weeks from now, my CEO is going on a yacht and I want to do this big thing against that. That's a new thing that's coming up. Did I remember to tell it that there's a new seasonality we're introducing into the business, etc.? So it doesn't need that Sherpa. It's gleaning that on its own. It calculates causality, which is the biggest differentiator here. So again, we're focused on not just something happened and will it happen again potentially, but why something happened and how do we make sure that your future actions are dependent on that causality. So again, sorry, I keep picking on the gentleman in the front row here with the black shirt, but basically getting an idea of does he like black, blue, and white, so the next time he goes into a store, it's not just a black shirt, but it's a combination of things that he might like. and then it leads you through your data. So the onus is on the system to tell you where to pay attention, where to focus, and the only guidance you're giving the system is a high-level guidance of, hey, I want to grow my business by X%. I want to grow my pipeline by X%. Everything else is the responsibility of the system to tell you, hey, this is what's happening, this is what we're going to do against it, this is how I propose you do it, and you are the one defining the parameters of how it needs to be done. So neural AI, again, that's the part of the system that thinks, that I should say it thinks and learns, and symbolic AI is primarily the thing that thinks against it. So neural AI is more broad, and then symbolic AI contextualizes it for your specific business. And then we combine the approaches so you can stop guessing and start reasoning. But not that you stop guessing and start reasoning, but then on top of your data, the system does that, so any decision that you take, obviously, you take with a higher level of confidence. So one danger sign, this is not a doom and gloom slide that I would put here, is as consumers of these technologies, one thing to be highly aware of is there is a lot of misinformation in the market. That doesn't mean that these tools are not great for things. They're great for what they are built for their purpose. Like large language models are excellent at language-related tasks. Large language models can do math, but large language models are essentially there for language-related tasks because they're most probably trained on language, as an example. So I'd say most AI marketing platforms that exist right now are not what you would put in the category of like true intelligence. They are probably in the category of like really smart, but not intelligent, meaning they're not fully governed systems. They're essentially your autocomplete for dashboards. One of the things that we did was we took structured data and we said, hey, it's taking me 30 minutes to merge 5 sheets together and get anything out of it. So then we like lobbed LLMs on top and said, can you just do that faster? And yes, it can do that faster, but the idea is that still doesn't get you everything that you need to get out of your data. So that's why I'm trying to move people towards the third S-curve. And again, last but not least, the onus will remain on you, right? So it's on you to pick the right questions to ask, to pick where to point the question in your data set, etc. But the idea here is that's still dressing up inside and calling it innovation because you want a system that is telling you, hey, look here, look here, look here, not a system where you're pointing the question which is inherently biased. You can always ask the system questions, but the idea is right now you are in a Tesla with a self-driving module, you're still at the steering wheel. We want to move you towards a Waymo, where you're telling the Waymo where to go, but essentially the car's picking the right way to get you there. That's what it really means to be data-driven. And this thing I'll leave you with, any AI system that you use, whether it's LLMs, whether it's predictive AI, etc., should never be a black box. So if it can't explain why it came to a certain conclusion, if it can't explain why something happened, if it can't really understand like systems behind or the network and connections behind why things are happening, it's not intelligent. And in our terms, in academic terms, we call that decorative, meaning it does look pretty. It looks like magic because it does things really fast. But at the end of the day, that's not what's going to drive your business, right? Even the best dressed people in the room know that you still need all the other things in order for you to get to where you need to go. So where does that leave you folks, essentially? I think broadly, there's a lot of tool fatigue because a ton of tools exist in the market. So my theory is you don't need more tools. You essentially need to find the tools that will give you the right kind of clarity. Amoeba is a tool that can give you that kind of clarity. I'm sure there are other tools or combinations of tools that you can use as well, but that's a good lens to keep in mind. If you are solving a process by hacking 13 tools together, the process is not solved and you might be solving for the wrong problem. So our job here is to essentially take you from that overwhelm, that feeling of anxiety that we felt when we saw all the papers on the desk, essentially to something where you free up enough of your brain space to cognitively be able to look at what's actually happening in your data. Essentially, next decade seems like a long time from now, but I think this is what we're working towards, where you're not looking at automation, right? We all jump to automation. Like everyone here probably is a huge fan of Clay, is a huge fan of some of these other tools that are coming out, but have a good grasp on what you're trying to automate, whether you're automating the right thing, essentially, and be very conscientious about that. In the case of Amoeba, Amoeba can also then help you figure out what are the things that you need to automate in order to drive your business that way. But a system that understands why instead of you having to constantly think about the why is what makes sense. For us, it's very simple. You can go and upload like your marketing data. You can ask it the 5 whys, ask it why something happened, then keep asking it, but why this, but why this, but why this? And then it should still be able to go through your data and keep giving you reasoning on like why something is happening. And for us, once you understand why something is happening, it's truly when we say intelligence is starting. So I'll ground it a little bit practically into kind of what use cases Amoeba solves, because at the end of the day, we are a like data intelligence platform. So we sit between your system of record and your system of action, as an example. But some of the use cases that we solve for is, one, self-service analytics. So you have an in-house analytics team, or you are the in-house analytics team in some cases, and you need to focus on other things or high-fidelity problems, and you don't constantly need to be running to someone to write SQL queries all the time, or you're tired of what data set do I even need to mush together, essentially, and thinking of things like what are the unique identifiers in that data set, because data normalization in itself is a huge problem. But Amoeba can help you solve for that. You don't have to normalize your data, that's taken care of within the platform itself. You don't have to think about data quality. Amoeba takes care of that as well. And if you don't have a ton of historical data or data gaps, we fill that in with synthetic data as well. So the idea there is that this is your best turnkey shot at just getting output out if you have a massive data set or a messy data set. Second is around web product analytics augmentation. So we talked a lot about kind of marketing, and you think about marketing data, most folks think of your CRMs, your traditional ad platforms, etc. But we are a little unusual. We sit on top of all your data, so your product data, your finance data, etc. Because again, all these pieces are together. So if you're running a PLG motion as an example, or imagine you're running a sales ad motion and a PLG motion, and you have a hard time figuring out how do I pull those data streams apart in a way to figure out what are the initiatives that will work for both and what are the initiatives that will work for just one or the other. This is the right kind of tool to help augment on top of existing tools that you might have. This is my most exciting one, which is simulated experimentation. Why not use the system to try experiments before you actually try them in market? For anyone who's run A/B tests, multivariate tests, we all know that the biggest problem is we'll be running a test and then we don't reach statistical significance. You'll run it for 6 weeks, you come back with almost 0 results, or you run it for a couple of weeks and then you come back with some lackluster results. So we give you the ability to simulate these within the platform. You can go even as far as to say what is the right kind of experiment to run if this is the hypothesis I want to test. And the hypothesis could be, again, really far-fetched. It could be a new ICP that you're exploring, or it could be controlled within the data that you have existing. But once you understand the simulations, it's really easy for you to say, okay, now that I understand it, now say the simulation said something about, okay, you should be experimenting with these styles of outbounds, then you use a tool like Humatic essentially to run that experiment. So the idea is this plays well with existing tools that you have, but then you have a better understanding of kind of what's happening in your data. And then last but not least, we're going into Q4, meaning we're all going into probably planning into Q1, right, essentially. Anyone who has done QBRs, any kind of monthly reports, weekly reports, quarterly reports, annual reports, that's why I call myself a marketer's friend, because I used to be inundated with those requests all the time, where my favorite marketers were like walking into boardroom conversations with their CFOs, planning budgets, etc. And then the entire team had to like come together and focus on pulling those reports or pulling those briefings out in a way that didn't feel narrative focused, right? So you know that A plus B equals C. You can build a narrative on top of that that is reflective of you. You can build a narrative on top of that is reflective of your CRO, etc. So Amoeba acts as like your neutral executive companion. You just schedule it to run your quarterly review. You schedule it to run your annual review. And you walk away with a budget plan. Quick plug here, actually, for those of you folks who are coming to the Marketing Summit in November, we'll actually be doing a workshop on this specifically, where you'll get to walk away with your plan for like fiscal year 2026, essentially, in hand. So for anyone who's coming there, please sign up for that workshop. And then how do customers see value? So again, it's a horizontal product, and because it's a horizontal product, sometimes ROI is a little bit harder, but I'll talk really quickly through how some of our customers are seeing value. So one of our customers heard, essentially, we're launching a new process across Reddit and TikTok. So TikTok was a brand new channel for them. So no historical data whatsoever, no understanding of how they would perform there. And then their sales qualified lead costs were rising because they generally do as you're experimenting with something new. So we connected obviously to their systems. We have a feature called Pulse where we can monitor for anomalies that are happening in your data against your business goals. And they noticed an 18% lower cost per SQL within, I would say, a period of a month and some change. 120K per waste was reallocated. So these are some general areas. We try to tie our ROI specifically to things that will be either revenue driving or revenue accelerating. Another example is Kindred Motorworks. Essentially, we optimized about $2 million in their spend. So they had an interesting problem where the deal cycles were a mix of a couple of months long and also a couple of years long combined, right? So it's hard to look at both of those together. And then we ended up for the multi-year deal cycles, shortening that by 3 months. And for folks in the room who kind of run deal cycles, 3 months is a pretty substantial window if you're able to reduce that. And we're waiting on some metrics back in terms of how that played out in terms of the ARR for the entire year. But we hope this was actually pretty substantial in terms of their growth as well. And then last but not least, it was SUSE. There were some policy shifts happening in the market. So again, this is data that is tacit to them, meaning that they're aware that there are shifts happening in the market. This is not data that's contained within their system to try to understand like what they can do against it. And then they saw a $3 million pipeline impact in 6 months from just our system pulling in some of that tacit information. So this is what I leave you with. This is our little amoeba. The sun is rising. Tomorrow morning, essentially, as you're waking up and then you're still like, oh gosh, I looked at my email and I have 50 inbound cold emails from all these different tools that are getting created. And that's the feeling of overwhelm. And like when I say waking up naked, that's that feeling. Just a bit of positivity here. You're not lost if you feel the overwhelm. It just is an indication of you're early. And then the future of intelligent marketing is already getting dressed, meaning you are early, but you cannot afford to get left behind, essentially. So I leave you with this kitschy note. Let Amoeba kind of work with you on helping you dress up your business. Thank you. Okay. So thanks, Arjun, for having me.
Thank you. So this is a common theme that you'll see in many tools now, that the past performance is not a indicator of what is going to happen, which has been the state of marketing for the last 25 some years. That everything is based on, okay, like A/B testing, I think is a big theme that AI is solving for, because if there are two people who respond differently, it's not necessary that they'll always respond differently. And people are different. They can just do whatever they want. So I think this is a theme that you'll see. Any questions?
Just a basic one. Is this an AI marketeer or is it somewhere down the food chain? In other words, does this have the ability to be a virtual marketeer?
It's an AI data scientist, so it's your companion, I would say to that. Yeah.
Can you explain a bit more about how you've overcome hallucinations with the product?
Yeah, so neurosymbolic AI, liquid neural nets actually don't have the same problems that large language models do in terms of hallucinations at all. And then we countered that. Behind every neural net, technically, you can have guardrails in terms of confidence thresholds, etc. So we have pretty rigorous guardrails. We come within 95% of confidence, and then everything is pushed out with a evidence pack. So it will never, all our analysis is done via the liquid neural net and the symbolic system together. So the output will never be incorrect based on the data that's sitting on it. And then 3% of our stack right now is a transformer model to then essentially turn that into some sort of language output, and then we have mitigation there, essentially. But at minimum, you might get a non-language based, like always correct answer. So we always over-index on accuracy over like language-based output. But happy to kind of share more documentation on that too if you're interested. Yeah.
Are you the only one that's doing neurosymbolic AI, or there are other players?
Now, when we first started a year and a half ago, we were the only ones. There are 8 companies. They're mostly in the coding pharma spaces, I would say. And then these are just algorithms, right? So eventually we imagine that you can build agents on top of them. Eventually you can use them for a bunch of other things, the same way you would use LLMs. But there are not that many folks who are using neurosymbolic. Neurosymbolic AI as a thing has existed since the 60s. Liquid neural nets have not existed in this capacity. So there are a lot of us that are working towards neurosymbolic AI architecture that would transform into neuromorphic architecture, which to your point will be the full running system where you don't necessarily have to even intervene But no,
So
not in this space.
are you suggesting that every autocomplete AI is going to move to neurosymbolic in the next
I
year?
think every agent will. If you think about everything that you have to do with an agent to make sure that an agent stays within guardrails, like all that stuff can go away if you're transitioning to neurosymbolic architecture, right?
Yeah.
So eventually you'll see with technologies how there'll be like a better together, where like right now our system works well on top of transformers or with transformers, and then eventually most of these systems will move towards neurosymbolic.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Thank you so much for the talk. Maybe I might have missed it, but two questions. One is, can you explain further how you eliminate the hallucination? Is it because you use the neurosymbolic approach? And what is the difference between multi-agent approach or orchestration in neurosymbolic, or if you can compare it at all?
Yeah, so I think let me define how we look at the term agent or how agents are in market right now. It's just autonomous systems that sit on top right now, mostly on transformer models, right? So neurosymbolic architecture is a completely different architecture. It's a neurosymbolic AI like algorithm. My neurosymbolic is on my arm right here because it was a part of my dissertation. So it's very proprietary to us, and that's why it's being developed in like very specific industries. Symbolic systems themselves, the liquid neural nets, actually don't have hallucination of a problem because the feature layer that generally causes neural nets to be expensive, meaning if you were to put a neural net on top of a data set, the first mapping is like very expensive. That feature layer is a lot smaller in a liquid neural net. So you run two levels of compute, which is a one-shot, meaning I'm asking it something, and then an always-on, which means the system is constantly assessing data points that are new against data points that exist.
Yeah.
So more than the algorithm itself, the key differentiator is that you have a living ontology, a living understanding of your business. And then the neurosymbolic model on top is the thing that does the calculation on top of that, right? So it just rids off things like, now all machine learning models have drift. All machine learning models will always have, and drift is generally could cause like things like inaccuracies, etc. So then you apply like mitigation techniques essentially against that. So for us, the system is modeled in a way that anything under 95% accuracy, even though the 5% seems huge, it's not, when you abstract it, it's actually not that huge of a percentage. Anything under 90, and anything that's like less than 95% actually doesn't even, we don't push that out as a calculation. We sit on top of a ton of calculations, and those calculations become aggregates, and those aggregates is like when you're running a one-shot scenario is what you populate your answers on top of. In terms of multi-agent systems, if you're talking about like multiple agents that are in the way of transformers, like we have a multi-agent system with neurosymbolic architecture in the background. So we have Atlas and Helix, which are our data mapping agents, like up top, and their job is essentially to figure out like where are the gaps in your data, but can we map them, NaN values, normalization, all of that. And then within the actual, like once that process is done, in the architecture itself, we have a couple of different agents like Nucleus, we have a goal setting agent, we have a tasks agent. But I think for most people, we don't talk about them as openly because to me, the system is more important. They're background agents. Their job is to make sure things are happening in the right way. And then for folks who are interested, they can come and ask. As a consumer, you should always have the right to audit the system as well, right? So for folks who are like interested in that, they can come and ask for audits of what happened with this or what happened with that. So those audit trails, because neural nets are glass boxes, those audit trails is what we use them for. Essentially, so when you come and say, give me the exact path of like how you got from this to this conclusion, we can give you that. So in our case also there's a multi-agent, but if I think about what's in the market right now, those are generally autonomous transformer-based multi-agent systems.
Cool, thank you. There are several other questions, Tooba, for you. I think it opened up a lot of minds, so
Okay.
Tooba will be here, so you can please
fine. I'm here. I'm in the
connect.
rest of the-